Welcome to IC, Becoming an Engineer, where we connect engineering education research with real-world practice, academia, and industry. Our goal is to create an inclusive space for dialogue, collaboration, and knowledge sharing across the engineering education sector in South Africa, positioning our unique challenges and innovations as a key voice in the global engineering education conversation. We explore the challenges and opportunities of engineering education in the Global South while linking our experiences to the broader international landscape. Whether you're an academic, industry professional, or a student curious about the future of engineering, this podcast offers meaningful discussions that go beyond research papers to unpack practical strategies for positive change. Join us as we bring together diverse voices, bridge perspectives, and reimagine engineering education for a more connected and impactful future.
I'm Ruben Govender.
And I'm Lilani Smith.
And today's conversation in our engineering education podcast centers on the lived experience of students, not just in their classrooms or their coursework, but in the everyday navigation of the systems that sometimes misunderstand or ignore the students' realities. As we're beginning the conversation with Curwyn, I feel we need to acknowledge that this episode will feel quite different even for an engineering education space, as being quite far away from that in some ways. It's a quieter conversation. It is slower in certain places, but part of that quietness and the difference is what I believe makes this conversation quite powerful listening for many of our colleagues who are engineering educators.
Yeah, I think for me, Ruben, what really stood out is Curwyn's invitation for us to pause, to really listen to the human stories, both of students and of staff, underneath the data, to notice things that we've been almost trained to overlook: emotions, context, the cost of coping. And I think in this episode, it's really challenged me in a way to rethink how do I really think about support? Like, what does support really mean for myself, for my colleagues, and also for my students?
Our guest, Curwyn Mapaling, is a psychologist working in engineering education, and Curwyn's research explores how engineering students develop and sustain resilience within educational institutions in South Africa. Curwyn's work moves beyond surface-level notions of student support to explore how emotion, identity, and institutional culture shape the learning journey. This episode is about listening differently and asking what engineering education would look like if we designed with care, context, and complexity in mind. So, Curwyn, welcome to you. Let's start off with your research journey. What's led you to this focus on the idea of resilience, and what do you see as missing in engineering education?
Sure. So at the time, in around 2018, I was working as an academic advisor for the School of Engineering and later the Faculty of Engineering at Nelson Mandela University. And that is what sort of led me to the interest in engineering. And I found that although within engineering and other educational contexts, resilience is often used to praise students who manage to cope. And we see this a lot in broader higher education discourse today as well. And I often see that, it's often praising the students without asking them what it costs to do so. So within my research and the research of other colleagues, we've been trying to understand what kind of environments require constant resilience and why do we normalize that within these high pressure or intense disciplines such as engineering and medicine and so on.
Okay. So there's this idea that resilience isn't just about being strong enough on your own, having that personal inner characteristics that let you cope, but you're saying that it's a bit of a signal that something in the system is problematic, that it's demanding those characteristics from people.
Yes. So depending on how you define resilience, so if we take it as bouncing back, which is often referred to, or like in the literature, we'd speak about that there has to first be adversity or academic adversity in our setting. And against that, there would have to then be resilience. So often within that definition, students carry many emotional burdens silently within one of many adversities that they face. And then there's the danger of seeing resilience as the sign of success instead of a deeper signal that structural issues are going on unaddressed, whether that's within the institution or within their residences where they find themselves, perhaps even what they've come with to university and what they've left behind. So all of that needs to be paid attention to.
Yeah, thank you, Curwyn. It's interesting as you're speaking about this, what's coming to my mind is the students' ability to cope. And in an environment where we often see that academics are also kind of struggling to cope. And so I'm wondering if we can talk about a little bit when we think about some of the more recent reports, especially in engineering education, that came from, for example, Ruth Graham's work, the Crisis and Catalyst report on the impact of COVID-19 in the global practice in engineering education. So I remember reading that report, and really what resonated with me, and I think it has always been in reality, but maybe being pushed to the forefront post-pandemic, was this idea of the students' well-being, mental well-being, at least it was used in that framing, as well as the academic staff's well-being. And in particular, I think there's this idea of resilience, and there's also this idea of like, how much capacity do I have as an individual to deal with the level of uncertainty and the constant changes that come our way, right? What I always wonder about is the staff members that are in there, they're doing everything they can for the students to support them on their journey, and them themselves carrying that weight, almost like that additional cost of like being there, supporting as much as you can because you care. And often there's a judgment towards our colleagues that don't spend so much time doing that, as in they don't care. I've often reflected, even in conversation with any of my colleagues, everyone really cares. That's why we are there. And it really just speaks about personal capacity to engage with the change or with the complexity that comes with standing next to or supporting a student that we can see is struggling with something that's not just fluid mechanics. We can clearly see something's going on, and problem is not that they can't integrate or they don't understand fluid mechanics, but it's broader than that, and it's without our domain of either capacity to engage with or complexity to engage with. So I wonder, in terms of that, and I know your involvement with the Emotions and Engineering Education Group has grown over the last couple of years. If you can say something about how, in relation to students' resilience and their ability to cope within this context, the potential importance of the academics' role and the academics' capacity as well.
Thanks, Leonie. So what you're speaking on ties in quite nicely with what was one of the, I'd say, more unexpected findings of my PhD on academic resilience of engineering students, where the students were actually reporting that in order for them to do better and for them to be more resilient, staff well-being does need to be taken and looked at, like you say. And I think often whether we want to call it the emotional strain or the emotional labor, the invisible work or the hidden curriculum, everything that goes on for academics, often behind the scenes, after hours, whether that's the stress, the self-doubt, the disconnection, which was further perpetuated by COVID-19 and online work and sort of not having fixed working hours with that. And I think even now, sort of coming out of the pandemic, a lot of the pandemic ways of being and working haven't really left us. So I think that's often misinterpreted as a lack of ability or motivation or laziness, And I think that further highlights to us how institutional cultures can overlook emotion, even though it's deeply tied to learning or lack thereof, or confidence or lack thereof, or even participation or lack thereof as well, from the academic side in terms of what they then are willing to take on, who's willing to go the extra mile, who's willing to, like you say, journey with the student. And are we still able to believe in an academia that still puts the student at the heart of the matter? Or have we potentially become, and understandably so, quite burnt out given COVID-19 and everything else that has continued, and this increasing sense that everything is urgent and everything is necessary, and it's necessary and urgent all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, it does feel like that. We're constantly fighting fires, and we don't have any capacity to stand still and figure out why is there a fire in the first place and what might we be overlooking. I mean, something that's really coming to mind is the idea of the emotional state of the student and also the academic. It's interesting, and I guess as a psychologist, you could perhaps help us understand this a bit better. I think significantly in engineering, it's quite often overlooked. We find ourselves in a knowledge domain that can make us quite easily believe that we hold objective truth, right? So we are trained and socialized into this idea of mathematics and sciences, and so you don't argue with gravity or momentum. You don't. There's a way to do an integration or differentiation. So it's not as simple or as complex, perhaps, as to engage with an emotion that, or emotional feedback or emotional data points, right? That can give you such nuanced information around what's going on in the learning process, what's going on in the engagement between the academic and the student in the classroom. So, yeah, I'm curious what kind of insights, what kind of information do you get from the work that you do? If you can talk a little bit about how you can get these emotional experiences in the form of data points that can give us feedback, and what can they tell us about our ecosystem, I guess, as a whole, our practice in the classroom, how institutions are organized, etc.
So I think exactly like you said, Lilani. So emotion isn't separate from teaching and learning or research, or even community engagement. I think we can see it across all three pillars of higher education, and it can help tell us what's working and what's not. So it's often a response to the context that we find ourselves in, and that's something that we need to take a lot more seriously. And I think that one of my favorite quotes from the PhD is, "It's not cool to be an engineer with feelings." And I think not just within engineering education, but even in psychology, even in other spaces, we seem to be moving away or losing touch with our sense of empathy within teaching and learning. And I think we need to really respond to emotion and empathy a lot more, because that will then really guide us as to how we can redesign some of our teaching and learning initiatives to meet not only students, but also the staff on the other end of that in a better place where we can then really find ourselves again, because there does seem to be a disconnect, especially after COVID.
Curwyn, so having kind of initiated some of these conversations with students about being open about what they're feeling while they're tackling these problems in engineering, science, and design and technically rooted things, the thing that often comes up is that the students will say we need support because they're dealing with all of these emotional things. And so from your perspective, what does that meaningful support look like when we step away from the idea of engineering being a cold scientific discipline?
Thanks, Ruben. So I think that for support to be meaningful, it needs to be meaningful for those that it's intended to, as opposed to those that are designing it. And I think often support focuses on the outcomes. So how many students attended a particular session? What's the uptake of the tutoring or the mentoring? What are the grades like, or the marks? How many students are completing? Are they completing in record time? And I think often we get so bogged down in those matrices that we'd rather try and focus on the data instead of listening to students' actual experiences, forgetting almost that the students' experiences and that student voice is also data, and that's been amplified since Fees Must Fall and other movements recently in higher education. So we need the support to be proactive rather than reactive, which is often the case. And we need it to be human and grounded within context. So how we support students at Nelson Mandela won't be the same, won't be as meaningful perhaps for students at UCT or at the University of Pretoria. So it needs to not just be reactive or generic. And from my research that I've done with the students, they've also said that it needs to be individualized and it needs to be holistic. So we don't just, need to offer them support academically. We also need to look at, and I see there's quite a bit of this now on LinkedIn in terms of universities posting about their meal a day projects and drives towards targeting student hunger. So, that's also an important element. So we really need to look at the student holistically, whether it's residents, student hunger, the tutoring, the mentoring, student counseling, looking at their well-being, needs to be holistic and individualized for that student within that course, in that province, at that specific university.
So that's, what you mentioned about the metrics. If we did an educational intervention, what is the impact of that in terms of the pass rate in the course going up or more students getting distinctions or whatever? I think that's something that those of us who've been involved in the process will hear. It's a familiar thing said in meetings and often amongst the people with the best of intentions in this space is that, as courses that are typically being taught by engineers and science people, we like numbers. We like to be able to measure things like that. And measuring performance in our courses is probably the easiest thing that we can measure. But what I'm hearing from you is that a measurement like that applied to a support intervention might be a little bit off target. And particularly when we consider like what's going on in our particular institution, wherever that may be. So perhaps you can kind of expand a little bit on those ideas.
So like you say, often the intention is good, but the execution can miss the mark, and it's not deliberately so. Like you say, people really do want the best for students most of the time, and I think that within that, support doesn't always recognize the broader institutional environment. And often so we speak about adversity, but also risks. So there will be personal risks, but also environmental, structural, institutional risks that the students have to face. And that would be what's sort of preventing them from being resilient academically or otherwise, because that places an additional burden on the student to adapt outside of adapting to the course, outside of adapting perhaps from moving, thousands of kilometers or hundreds of kilometers away from home to come and study at a particular institution. They then also need to adapt to their student life, their life there, depending on their developmental stage. They might also be adapting to a phase of life all at the same time. Life doesn't stop happening as we try to then support them. So I think often we need to focus on this rather than or rather we need to speak to the students themselves rather than avoiding the context or almost ignoring the structure that all of this is taking place in. And also I think there's also something quite human. So yes, maybe engineers like marks and percentages and so on, but I think also as humans we gravitate to what we can easily observe. And I think, for even those of us that aren't exactly a fan of numbers, sometimes seeing that pie chart or bar graph showing an increase in something or a larger piece of the pie is doing better, I think is something quite natural and human to resonating with that and wanting that to also almost motivate those of us that are implementing certain initiatives, or I don't like the word interventions, but we still use the word, to see if it is still being effective in that way.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of an example that we grappled with in our department related to this, where it was the question of tests being written in the evenings at certain times. And that's something that had emerged, and it kind of came out of, fees must fall and protest things pre-COVID, that for students who were reliant on public transport to and from campus, that a test that finished at 7 o'clock or 7:30 in the evening was an enormous stress because it meant that they would then be sitting on a bus, train, minibus, taxi, etc. at a very quiet time of night when you didn't have the kind of safety of the normal going home traffic, and that this was really impacting on their emotional state in the test, because there was when I finish this test, I've got to try and make it home without encountering a criminal, right? And that this is a thing that's like, it's so outside of what you would think of in planning an engineering science educational experience. Any kind of design, whatever, any education experience, but as you said, it's broader things, and that how does the student perform under those circumstances? We came to the conclusion that they couldn't, so we had to think differently about when do tests finish. Is it okay for students to say to a student, you must still be on campus at this time or you will fail the course, and what that was doing to them? So
Yeah, I like that your department is able to go there and to see the student and to demonstrate empathy actually quite nicely. I feel that often, whether it's the administrators or the academic staff, or even some support staff, often we aren't quite able to effectively advocate for the student in the manner in which you've just demonstrated now in that example. And I think we definitely need more of that, there's almost this, I don't know if academic initiation is the right way of putting it, but sometimes we want to unnecessarily make things hard because it was hard for us, or because back then, it was okay for us to have these tests in the evening, not recognizing that times have changed and that there's a lot of socioeconomic factors and social political factors and crime and all these other things that we need to take into account for the modern day student today.
Mm. Yeah, I agree, Ruben. I think that is a really nice example of how, I mean, Curwyn, you mentioned something around how instead of placing the burden on students to adapt, that we'd rather question the structures themselves of like how we've come up with these different institutional environments or rules that we've just made up, really. It feels like, at least in the case that Ruben is describing, a really nice example of how the student's voice can influence institutional change. And I was wondering how else we can think of the role that the student's voice can play. What other examples have you seen in terms of how the student's voice can influence the institutional change aspects for the better?
Mm. I think the student voice, sometimes I think it's louder at some institutions than in others, but I think that regardless of which institution, I think it's gotten loud enough to a point where we can no longer ignore it as much as certain institutions or certain management may want to continue to try to do that. But I do think that students have insights that go beyond what the traditional evaluations can capture. And I've seen there's even some literature critiquing the use of these evaluations, whether it's the evaluations we send to students as lecturers or as supervisors, and then often this is the kind of stuff that we all have to collate when it's time for that promotion application, because for some of us there's a lot of dis-ease around that, and I think that there's also a need for institutions to create spaces that don't just invite the feedback but genuinely value it. So there's been various instances of management, sometimes even the VCs meeting with students, and sometimes that in itself, depending on what happened before leading up to that platform or what happens after that, can also then give us an indication of whether it was a tick box exercise or if it was a genuine engagement that was really meant to meet the students. And we also see similar engagements where management then meets with staff for similar reasons. So I think these spaces, we don't just need to create them, but we genuinely need to value them and enforce the feedback that we gain from them.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It almost feels to some degree the way that you're describing it. In a community setting, things need to happen, right? Like every person having a voice and leaders, VCs coming down to speak to students and how we encourage that conversation going forward and leading to actionable items, right? Not just being a conversation like lip service, but really moving to some change. It's reminding me of something that was quite surprising for me in the most recent work that we've done around change makers as part of the national IEC project. And one of the surprising things that we found was a lot of academics talking about this idea of sense of belonging. And for me, it was quite interesting because often in spaces where they talk about student support, they talk about creating peer community groups, they talk about sense of belonging, but you never hear it specifically in the context of academic sense of belonging, right? Like us as academics feeling like we belong in this space. So it feels like this idea of belonging, whether you're a student, whether you're an academic staff member, whether you're a leader in the institution, feels quite important. And I wonder how, in the research that you've done, you've seen indications of those. How have you come into contact with sense of belonging? And maybe on both sides. I don't know if you've had student and academic belonging come up.
I think in many ways now, Leilani, you're reminding me about the sort of unwritten paper. I think that's the draft that I still need to finish is actually about this. So I think that for belonging, needs to start being viewed as more than just being present in the space. So just because I find myself in a certain space doesn't automatically give me this, sense of belonging. But it's about really being recognized, and we can think about some of Nancy Fraser's work about misrecognition, and how that's also able to be applied within higher education. And am I recognized? Am I heard? Am I respected? Both as a student and as an academic or support staff member. And often these institutional spaces that we find ourselves in, either through the systems that don't always speak to each other or that don't always make sense, or through management, or through institutional culture. And sometimes it's this ingrained institutional culture that needs to change. But really, there's this group of people that might still be reinforcing it and holding on to it for certain reasons. But there's these subtle or not so subtle signals that we can get around, who's expected to thrive, who's enabled to thrive, and then who's being constrained and who's merely just being tolerated in the space. And I guess we could have broader philosophical conversations also around what that looks like in post-apartheid South Africa, with all the policies around transformation and so on. But I think at the simplest level, we really need to start feeling as if we are truly seen, heard, recognized, and respected for who we are, for what we bring, both as a staff and student. Because you can also think around humanizing pedagogy, where the student is not a blank slate. They bring with them their homes, their past experiences, their previous knowledge. In part of being more than present, or part of seeing them for who they are, is also fully recognizing them and their humanity within the teaching and learning space.
Yeah, thank you for that, Curwyn. I think it feels almost like a collective initiative. This is not something that just one person will be able to stand up and say or stand up and do different. And I think the more of us that can move together, it's a quite complex system with complex moving parts. And so I think it's encouraging to hear all the different indicators that you have picked up already. And that unwritten paper, please, can we have it soon? I think we need it.
Curwyn, there's a lot to digest over there, and I suppose there's sort of two sets of groups of stakeholders, and let's talk to the ones that we're familiar with, the educators and the lecturers in the classroom. What are things that you would like them to reflect on? What are the key takeaways for the lecturers?
I think to reflect on our teaching philosophies, not just as a document that we put together when we're applying for a post or a promotion, but for us to really make that theory living theory. So the theories that we say we are underpinning our teaching and learning, that we actually then enforce it and live it, and that it becomes present when someone captures, 5 more minutes or half an hour of our teaching, that they can actually see that we embody the theory that we claim to put forward. And to, in doing so, also then pay attention to what's not being said. So to look beyond the performance and the class averages and so on, and to ask the students, what are they navigating silently? So what are they dealing with? If you are getting 50%, what is sitting in the other 50%? What is going on at home or in your ears or in other spaces that is taking away from, the other marks that I, as an educator, might have expected or might have wanted them to achieve. So I think to invite our fellow educators to see teaching not just as content delivery, but as relational and ethical work. And I know that's quite a tall order, because that is, as we said earlier, it's the invisible, emotional, hidden work. And often that can have implications for our own well-being. So we do need to take care of ourselves as we go down this path. But that's what would be the encouragement from my side.
So the other very clear stakeholder in the space is the students in our classrooms, in our institutions. What are the things that you'd like the students to see and to reflect and think about what it means for them and what we've spoken about?
So I think As a colleague of mine at Nelson Mandela always used to say, Ronald Pike, she's quite well known in the space as well. I think it's even in her email signature. She says, your story matters, you know. And I think to remind students that their feelings, their challenges, their experiences, that's all valid, despite not always being made to feel that they are valid, either by educators or by the system or by the institution, and to encourage them to find their strength in reflection, in community, and in speaking up, so that they don't feel alone as they're still figuring it out. You know, others are also figuring it out and going through this journey. And I think sometimes intensive courses like engineering can feel quite lonely and can feel quite isolating. But there's a lot of power in community, speaking up, and strength in reflection and so on.
Curwyn, thank you so much, both for sharing about your journey and the insights that your research and observations that teaching practice bring to us. I think there's a lot of ideas over there that need to challenge us as engineering educators to think about how we view so many things. What do we consider to be success in our classrooms and our programs? What does it mean to be supportive of our students? Why do our students need to be resilient? And I think at the core of that is this idea that as much as engineering is a technical subject, engineering education is fundamentally still a human social endeavor, that without students in my classroom, what is my value as a teacher? And that the success of whatever we're doing is so strongly tied to everybody having some growth and some success in that space. So thank you very deeply for everything that you shared and the ideas that it's helping us to think about and to crystallize. To the listeners out there, hope that this has been thought-provoking, and we hope that you're going to follow us for some more episodes and things that bridge research, lived experiences of lecturers and staff, and actions that we can take in our classrooms and our institutions to make this a positive experience for everybody. There'll be some links to helpful things in the notes, and we will see you in our next episode.